The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with their usual soft hiss, but something felt different today. Ambassador Kevin Harper's chair sat empty again, and this marked the third time in a row that the human representative had failed to appear. Council Chairman Zex Thale of the Altarian Republic noticed the vacant seat immediately as his large eyes swept across the semicircular arrangement of delegates from 47 different worlds. For 20 years, Kevin Harper had been a constant presence in these halls, and his absence created an uncomfortable void that seemed to make the chamber feel larger and colder than usual. The human ambassador had never been the loudest voice in the room, but his steady presence and thoughtful questions had become something the other delegates had grown to expect. And even Depend Up and Zextel tapped his communication pad and sent a quick message to his assistant asking about the human delegation's status, but the response came back with troubling news. Not only had Kevin Harper failed to attend the session, but his entire staff had stopped responding to routine communications 3 days ago. The human embassy building on the station remained sealed, and automated messages were the only responses to any attempts at contact. Captain Lisa Morgan had also gone silent, and this worried many of the trade representatives, who relied on her detailed reports from the Outer Rim colonies. For years, Lisa had been the most reliable source of information about shipping lanes and colonial developments in the frontier sectors. Her monthly briefings had become essential reading for anyone involved in galactic commerce, and her sudden silence left a significant gap in their understanding of what was happening in those distant regions. Dr. Danny Walsh was another human who had simply vanished from the galactic communication networks, and his absence was felt immediately by the scientific community. The xenobiology research stations that he managed had been producing groundbreaking discoveries about alien plant life and their potential medical applications. His research teams included scientists from 12 different species, and they all reported that Dr. Walsh had simply stopped answering his messages without any explanation or warning. Pattern was becoming impossible to ignore as more reports came in throughout the day. Human representatives across dozens of systems had simultaneously ceased all communication with their alien colleagues. They had not issued any statements or made any demands, and there had been no signs of distress or conflict. They had simply stopped talking, and this silence was more unsettling than any angry words or threats could have been. Fleet Admiral Betty Knox commanded one of the largest human naval groups in the galaxy, and her ships had been patrolling the contested border regions between Council space and the aggressive hegemony forces. These patrol routes were crucial for maintaining peace and preventing small incidents from escalating into larger conflicts. Her fleet had suddenly withdrawn from their positions 3 days ago without any explanation to the Council's military coordination office. The withdrawal had not been hasty or panicked, and this made it even more puzzling. Admiral Knox's ships had completed their scheduled maintenance checks and had left their patrol zones in perfect formation with all procedures followed correctly. The only thing missing was any communication about why they were leaving or where they were going next. Trade Coordinator Paul Davis had sent his final message exactly 1 week ago, and it had been brief and professional like all his previous communications. He had simply stated that all pending commercial agreements were being canceled due to internal restructuring within human space. No details were provided about what kind of restructuring was taking place or how long it might last. The automated response systems that had replaced human communication were polite but frustratingly vague. Every attempt to contact Earth directly or any human colony world resulted in the same message being delivered by computer voices that lacked any emotion or personality. The message always said that humanity appreciated the Council's concern, but required time for internal deliberation and requested that their need for privacy be respected during this period. Xthul called for a recess, and gathered with several other senior council members in one of the smaller meeting rooms adjacent to the main chamber. Representative Veltar of the Crystalline Collective was clearly agitated, and his crystalline form was shifting through various shades of red and orange, which indicated high levels of stress. Among his species, the crystalline delegate had worked closely with humans on several major projects over the past decade, and he found their sudden silence particularly disturbing. Humans had always been direct in their communications, and if they had concerns or complaints, they typically voiced them loudly and clearly. This silent withdrawal was completely unlike their usual behavior patterns. Economic analyst Maria Williams had been scheduled to present a major trade proposal at today's session, and her absence meant that important negotiations would have to be postponed indefinitely. The proposal involved complex shipping arrangements between 7 different star systems, and Maria's expertise in human trade networks made her participation essential for any successful implementation. Military strategist General Carl Peterson had been working on a joint training exercise between human forces and several alien military units, and the project had been progressing well until all communication suddenly stopped. The exercise was designed to improve cooperation between different species. Military doctrines and General Peterson's innovative approaches had been showing promising results. Silence was not limited to official government representatives either. Dr. Helen Cruz, who ran several civilian research facilities, had also stopped responding to messages from her academic colleagues. Her work on quantum communications was considered revolutionary, and many scientists across the galaxy had been eagerly awaiting her next research papers. Engineer Lucy Thompson had designed infrastructure systems that were being used on dozens of worlds, and her maintenance schedules and upgrade recommendations were followed religiously by construction teams throughout council space. Her sudden absence left many projects without the technical guidance they needed to continue safely. Captain Amy Foster commanded merchant vessels that handled some of the most complex shipping routes in the galaxy, and her company's efficient logistics networks had become essential for moving goods between distant star systems. Without her ships and her expertise, many trade routes were already showing signs of disruption. Commander Jake Miller's patrol fleets had been responsible for keeping pirate activity under control in several key sectors, and early reports suggested that criminal organizations were already taking advantage of the reduced human presence in those areas. The security situation was deteriorating rapidly without the steady pressure the human forces had been maintaining. Dr. Steve Brown operated medical facilities that served multiple species, and his hospitals had been pioneers in developing treatments that worked across different alien biologies. Many patients were now wondering if their ongoing treatments would continue without human medical support. The council session reconvened after the recess, but the mood remained tense and uncertain. Delegate after delegate stood to report similar patterns of human withdrawal from their respective sectors and regions. The scope of the silence was becoming clear, and it was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Reviewed his notes and tried to make sense of what was happening, but no clear explanation emerged from the available information. Humans had not demanded anything from the council, and they had not complained about any specific policies or decisions. They had simply stopped participating in galactic civilization without offering any reasons for their choice. The session ended with more questions than answers, and every delegate left the chamber feeling unsettled about what this human silence might mean for the future of galactic cooperation. The humans had been difficult partners at times, but their absence was already creating problems that no one had anticipated. As the delegates returned to their quarters and offices across the station, the emptiness of the human sections seemed to grow more noticeable. Restaurants that had served human food sat empty, and entertainment venues that had catered to human tastes were closing their doors due to lack of customers. Silence was spreading beyond just official communications, and it was becoming clear that something fundamental had changed in humanity's relationship with the rest of the galaxy. What that change meant and where it might lead remained completely unknown to everyone except the humans themselves. Council would have to wait and watch as the implications of this silence slowly revealed themselves over the coming days and weeks, but already there were signs that the galaxy was becoming a very different place, without human voices contributing to its conversations and decisions. 6 months had passed since humanity first went silent, and the galaxy was beginning to understand just how much it had been depending on human participation in daily operations. The trade routes that Captain Amy Foster had carefully planned and maintained were showing serious strain as shipping companies from other species struggled to manage the complex logistics that humans had made look effortless. Problems started small with delayed deliveries and minor scheduling conflicts. They quickly grew into major disruptions that affected entire star systems. Without Amy's detailed knowledge of cargo, requirements, and optimal shipping paths, many companies were forced to use longer and more expensive routes. Some of the more remote colonies were experiencing shortages of basic supplies because their delivery schedules had been completely dependent on human shipping networks. Commander Jake Miller's patrol zones had become hunting grounds for pirate organizations that had been lying low during the years of human enforcement. The pirates were well organized, and they had clearly been studying human patrol patterns for weaknesses. Without Jake's ships to maintain regular security sweeps, 3 different merchant convoys had been attacked in the past month alone. The pirate raids were becoming bolder and more frequent as criminal groups realized that the response times from non-human security forces were much slower than what they had grown accustomed to during the years of human cooperation. The alien military units were competent, but they lacked the aggressive pursuit tactics that human commanders had developed for dealing with raiders. Dr. Helen Cruz's quantum communication research had been on the verge of a major breakthrough that would have revolutionized how information traveled between distant star systems. Her team had been working on reducing transmission delays from days to mere hours across galactic distances. Without her continued leadership, the project had stalled completely, and other scientists were struggling to understand her complex theoretical frameworks. The medical advances that Dr. Steve Brown's hospitals had been developing were no longer being shared with the broader galactic medical community. His research into cross-species treatments had been saving lives across dozens of different alien biologies. Several ongoing clinical trials had to be suspended because the human medical expertise needed to continue them safely was no longer available. Council member Veltar of the Crystalline Collective grew more agitated with each passing week as reports of human withdrawal continued to arrive from across the galaxy. His crystalline form had settled into a constant dark purple color that indicated deep concern among his species. During council sessions, he frequently spoke about how humans had provided a crucial counterbalance to the more conservative voices. In galactic politics, the crystalline delegate had worked with humans on environmental restoration projects, and he understood better than most how human approaches to problem-solving differed from traditional alien methods. Humans were willing to try unconventional solutions and take calculated risks that other species found uncomfortable. Without their influence, the Council's decisions were becoming more cautious and less innovative. Economic analyst Maria Williams had been the architect of several major trade agreements that kept multiple star systems economically stable. Her innovative solutions to complex financial problems had prevented at least 3 different economic collapses over the past 5 years. Without her expertise to guide ongoing negotiations, several of those same systems were now showing signs of financial instability. The trade proposal that Maria had been scheduled to present 6 months ago involved creating new shipping partnerships between agricultural worlds and industrial centers. The project had been designed to reduce costs and improve efficiency for all. participants, but without her guidance, the negotiations had fallen apart completely. Now those same worlds were facing food shortages and production delays that could have been prevented. Military strategist General Carl Peterson had been working on joint training programs that improved cooperation between different species' military forces. His unconventional diplomatic approaches had quietly prevented several minor border disputes from escalating into serious conflicts. In his absence, two of those same disputes had already reignited, and casualty reports were climbing steadily. Training exercises that General Peterson had designed were based on human military doctrines that emphasized flexibility and rapid response to changing situations. Other species' military traditions were more formal and structured, which made them effective in planned operations, but less adaptable when dealing with unexpected developments. Ambassador Tony Roberts had been living at the human embassy on Centauri Prime for over 8 years, and his knowledge of local politics and cultural customs had made him invaluable for resolving disputes between human colonists and alien populations. The embassy building had been sealed for months, and local authorities were reporting increasing tensions between different species without Tony's mediation skills to help resolve conflicts. Long-range scouts were reporting strange activity around human worlds and colonies, but all attempts to investigate further were politely blocked by automated defense systems. The reports described massive construction projects and unusual ship movements, but no details could be obtained about what humans were actually building or where their ships were going. Dr. Nancy Young's terraforming research had been scheduled to begin restoration work on 3 dead worlds that had been damaged by previous wars. Her techniques for rebuilding damaged ecosystems were considered the most advanced in the galaxy, and several alien species had been eagerly waiting for her projects to begin. Without her expertise, those worlds would remain uninhabitable for decades, or possibly centuries longer. Engineer Lucy Thompson's infrastructure designs had become the standard for construction projects throughout Council space. Her systems were efficient and reliable, and most importantly, they could be maintained by workers from multiple different species. Construction teams were still following her existing plans, but without new designs and updates, many projects were being delayed or canceled entirely. The younger council members, led by Representative Colmesh of the Epsilon Syndicate, were becoming increasingly frustrated with humanity's continued silence. They argued that the council should not have to beg for human participation, and that other species could certainly manage galactic affairs without human input. Some of them suggested that humanity's withdrawal was actually an opportunity for other species to take on larger roles in galactic governance. However, the older and more experienced council members remembered the galaxy before humans had joined the council 20 years earlier. They recalled how much more difficult it had been to reach agreements between different species, and how many conflicts had seemed impossible to resolve. Human representatives had brought fresh perspectives and creative solutions that had helped bridge gaps between very different alien cultures. Chairman Zexthal found himself reviewing old session records to understand how much the council's decision-making processes had changed since humans first joined. Human delegates had often asked uncomfortable questions that forced other species to reconsider their assumptions. They had also been willing to propose compromises that other delegates had been too proud or too cautious to suggest. The economic impact of human withdrawal was becoming more severe with each passing month. Trade volumes were down significantly across multiple sectors, and several shipping companies had declared bankruptcy. The complex financial instruments that Maria Williams had created to stabilize interstellar commerce were beginning to fail. Without her ongoing management and adjustments, diplomatic relations between several alien species were also deteriorating without human mediators to help resolve disputes. Humans had often served as neutral parties in conflicts between other species because they had no ancient territorial claims or historical grudges that complicated their involvement. Other species found it much harder to trust each other's mediation. Efforts to silence from human space remained as complete and mysterious as it had been on the first day. Automated systems continued to provide polite but unhelpful responses to all communication attempts. The messages never varied, and they never provided any additional information about what humans were doing or when they might resume normal diplomatic relations. Some council members began to speculate that humanity was preparing to make demands, or perhaps planning some kind of dramatic return to galactic affairs. Others worried that the silence indicated preparation for military action against council space. A few delegates suggested that humans might be planning to leave the galaxy entirely, but this idea was dismissed as too extreme to be realistic intelligence. Reports from the borders of human space described increasing activity around shipyards and construction facilities, but no details could be obtained about what was being built. The scale of the construction projects appeared to be enormous, but their purpose remained completely unknown to outside observers. As the 6-month mark passed and moved towards 7 months, the council was forced to acknowledge that whatever humans were doing during their silence, it was not a temporary interruption in normal operations. A full year had passed since humanity's voices had gone silent across the galaxy, and the Galactic Council was finally beginning to understand the true extent of what they had lost. The realization came not through dramatic revelations, but through the slow accumulation of problems that seemed minor individually, but together painted a picture of systemic collapse. Economic analyst Maria Williams had been more than just another trade representative, and her absence was proving catastrophic for galactic commerce. The Prosperity Treaty that she had designed 3 years earlier was the foundation that kept 12 star systems from complete economic collapse. Her innovative solutions had created interdependent trade relationships that balanced the strengths and weaknesses of different worlds. Without Maria's ongoing guidance and adjustments, the Prosperity Treaty was beginning to fail in ways that no one had anticipated. The agricultural worlds that provided food for industrial systems were demanding higher prices because they no longer trusted the financial guarantees that Maria had negotiated. The industrial worlds were threatening to cancel contracts because they could not afford the increased costs. 2 of the 12 systems covered by the treaty were already showing signs of civil unrest as unemployment rose and basic necessities became more expensive. The local governments were struggling to maintain order, and several had requested council intervention to prevent complete social breakdown. The council was discovering that Maria's work had been the invisible foundation that held together much. More than anyone had realized military strategist General Carl Peterson had prevented 3 separate conflicts from escalating into system-wide wars through his unconventional diplomatic approaches. His methods had seemed almost casual to outside observers, but they had been based on deep understanding of how different species approached honor and territory disputes in general. Peterson's absence, 2 of those conflicts had already reignited with a vengeance that surprised everyone involved. The border dispute between the mining guilds and the agricultural confederacy had escalated from angry words to actual shooting within 6 months of his disappearance. Casualty reports were climbing daily, and neither side seemed willing to consider the compromises that Peterson had been quietly arranging. The third conflict was showing similar signs of deterioration as old grievances resurfaced without Peterson's careful management to keep them under control. His ability to find face-saving solutions for proud warrior cultures had been essential for maintaining peace, and without him, those same cultures were reverting to more traditional methods of settling disputes. Chairman Zexthal spent long hours reviewing personnel records and historical files, trying to understand how humanity's contributions had become so deeply embedded in galactic civilization. The records showed that humans had never sought prominent positions or demanded recognition for their efforts. They had simply identified problems and worked quietly to solve them engineer Lucy Thompson's infrastructure. Designs had become the standard across the galaxy, not because they were imposed by human authority, but because they worked better than anything else available. Her systems were efficient and reliable, but more importantly, they were designed to be maintained by workers from multiple different species. This had seemed like a minor consideration when the designs were first implemented, but it had proven crucial for galactic cooperation. The maintenance schedules and upgrade recommendations that Lucy had provided were still being followed religiously by construction teams throughout Council space, but without new designs and technical support, many projects were reaching critical points where human expertise was essential. Several major space stations were approaching maintenance deadlines that required Lucy's specific knowledge to complete safely. Diplomat Frank Garcia's mediation techniques were still being taught in council academies, and his methods had become standard practice for resolving disputes between different species. However, the techniques were becoming less effective over time because Frank was no longer available to provide guidance for handling new types of conflicts that did not fit his established frameworks. The younger council members, led by Representative Colmesh of the Epsilon Syndicate, continued to argue that the council should not depend so heavily on any single species. They maintained that humanity's withdrawal was an opportunity for other species to develop their own solutions and take greater responsibility for galactic governance. However, Colmesh's own efforts to replace human contributions were proving more difficult than he had expected. His attempts to redesign trade agreements without Maria Williams's input had resulted in proposals that favored his own species at the expense of others. Other council members quickly rejected these proposals and accused the Epsilon Syndicate of trying to exploit humanity's absence for their own benefit. Older council members who had worked closely with humans for many years tried to explain why human approaches had been so effective. Humans had possessed a unique combination of technical competence and cultural neutrality that made them ideal mediators and problem solvers. They had no ancient territorial claims or historical grudges that complicated their relationships with other species. Ambassador Kevin Harper had often quoted human sayings during council sessions, and one that several delegates remembered was that actions speak louder than words. The wisdom of this saying was becoming clearer as the council struggled to understand what humanity's silence was trying to communicate. Dr. Danny Walsh's research stations had been producing more than just scientific discoveries, and his absence was creating gaps in knowledge that affected medical treatment across multiple species. His xenobiology work had been essential for understanding how different alien physiologies responded to various treatments and diseases. Several medical emergencies had occurred where doctors needed Dr. Walsh's expertise to treat patients from species that he had studied extensively. Without his research databases and ongoing guidance, these patients had received suboptimal care, and some had died from conditions that could have been treated successfully. With human medical knowledge, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore as reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy. Humans had not been the most numerous or the most powerful species in the Council, but they had been connected to virtually every aspect of galactic civilization in ways that were only becoming apparent through their absence. Captain Lisa Morgan's detailed reports from the Outer Rim colonies had been essential for understanding economic and social developments in frontier regions. Without her information, the Council was making decisions about colonial policy based on outdated or incomplete data. Several recent policy changes had proven counterproductive because they did not account for conditions that Lisa would have reported. Admiral Betty Knox's naval forces had been providing more than just military security in their patrol zones. Her ships had been conducting rescue operations and providing emergency assistance to civilian vessels in distress. The merchant marine associations were reporting significant increases in shipping losses and crew casualties since human patrols had been withdrawn. Trade coordinator Paul Davis had canceled all pending commercial agreements, but the full impact of this Decision was only becoming clear as existing contracts expired without renewal. Many shipping companies had built their business models around long-term agreements that Paul had negotiated, and they were struggling to find replacement contracts on comparable terms. Dr. Helen Cruz's quantum communications research had been scheduled to begin testing phases that would have revolutionized interstellar communication within the next 2 years. Without her continued leadership, the project had been abandoned completely, and the galaxy would have to wait decades or possibly centuries for another opportunity to achieve similar advances. Council chamber felt larger and emptier during each session as delegates gradually understood that humanity's contributions had been woven throughout the fabric of galactic civilization. The empty human section was no longer just an absence, but a symbol of how much the galaxy had lost. Intelligence Chief Morden of the Shadow Republic provided increasingly detailed reports about activities in human space, but the information only deepened the mystery surrounding humanity's withdrawal. The construction projects were enormous in scale and appeared to involve technologies that were not familiar to alien observers. Human shipyards were operating at maximum capacity and producing vessels on a scale that suggested some kind of massive undertaking, but the purpose remained completely unknown. The energy signatures detected around human worlds indicated industrial activity that exceeded anything previously observed in human space. Some council members began to worry that humanity's silence was preparation for military action against council space, but others argued that human behavior patterns did not support this theory. Humans had always been direct about their complaints and had never shown interest in conquest or territorial expansion. The reports from human space suggested preparation for something unprecedented, but whether it was military expansion or some other purpose entirely remained unclear. What was certain was that humanity was engaged in activities that would have significant implications for the entire galaxy. 2 years had passed since humanity's withdrawal from galactic civilization, and the Galactic Council faced the greatest crisis in its recorded history. The Hegemony War had resumed with devastating intensity once human forces were no longer maintaining the buffer zones that had kept hostile factions separated. Without Admiral Betty Knox's patrol fleets to provide early warning and rapid response, the aggressive Hegemony forces had launched surprise attacks that caught Council defenses completely unprepared. The death toll was climbing rapidly as civilian populations found themselves trapped in war zones that had been peaceful for over a decade. Refugee ships filled with families fleeing. The violence were overwhelming Council support systems that had not been designed to handle mass evacuations. The supply lines that had kept these border regions stable had collapsed without human merchant vessels to maintain the complex logistics networks. Dr. Nancy Young's revolutionary terraforming techniques could have restored 3 dead worlds that were desperately needed as refugee resettlement sites, but her research remained locked away behind humanity's impenetrable information barriers. The dead worlds had sufficient land mass and basic resources to support millions of displaced civilians, but without Nancy's expertise, they would remain uninhabitable wastelands while people suffered in overcrowded refugee camps. Council Chairman Is Hextall had authorized increasingly desperate measures to re-establish contact with humanity, but every attempt had met with the same polite but firm rejection. Diplomatic ships dispatched to the borders of human space were turned away by automated defense platforms that delivered identical messages in multiple languages. The platforms were clearly of human design, but they showed no willingness to engage in actual conversation or negotiation. The messages never varied in their content, and they provided no hope for future communication opportunities. Humanity appreciated the Council's concern but maintained its need for privacy and requested that no further contact attempts be made at this time. The automated systems were sophisticated enough to respond to different types of approach, but they always delivered essentially the same. Rejection Intelligence Chief Morden of the Shadow Republic had been authorized to conduct deep reconnaissance. Missions into human space, but even these covert operations had failed to gather useful intelligence. Human detection systems had improved dramatically during their period of isolation, and they were identifying and intercepting alien scouts with remarkable efficiency. Reports that Morden-S agents managed to gather before being expelled were disturbing and confusing in equal measure. Human space had become a hive of activity with construction projects on a scale that defied explanation. New shipyards were being built at an unprecedented rate, and the energy signatures suggested industrial capacity that far exceeded anything humans had possessed before their withdrawal commander Rick Hayes had commanded. Approximately 300 vessels when human forces first went silent, but current estimates suggested that human naval strength had tripled or possibly quadrupled during the past 2 years. The construction was taking place across dozens of star systems simultaneously and appeared to be following some kind of coordinated master plan. The ships being built were unlike anything in existing human fleet configurations, and their purpose remained completely mysterious to outside observers. They were much larger than typical military vessels, but they did not appear to be designed primarily for combat operations. Some of the new ships were enormous, even by capital ship standards, and their construction required resources that suggested humanity was committing its entire industrial capacity to whatever project they were pursuing. Trade Representative Julie Adams had been in the middle of negotiating a complex peace agreement between the mining guilds and the Agricultural Confederacy when humanity went silent 2 years earlier. Her unique perspective and innovative solutions had been essential for bridging the gap between two very different cultures that had fundamentally incompatible approaches to resource management and territorial rights. Without Julie's mediation, the negotiations had collapsed into open hostility that was now threatening to destabilize several star systems. The mining guilds needed access to agricultural worlds for food production, but they had no understanding of how to negotiate with cultures that viewed land as sacred rather than simply a resource to be exploited. The Agricultural Confederacy was equally unable to comprehend the guild's need for mineral extraction. It seemed destructive and wasteful. Conflict had escalated beyond economic disputes into actual warfare as both sides recruited mercenary forces to protect their interests. Several worlds that had been neutral in the original dispute were being forced to choose sides as the violence spread beyond the initial combat zones. The peace agreement that Julie had been crafting would have prevented all of this suffering, but her disappearance had doomed the negotiations to failure. Some council members were beginning to speculate that humanity's silence was preparation for conquest and that the massive construction projects were military preparations for an invasion of council space. Representative Colmesh of the Epsilon Syndicate had become increasingly vocal in his warnings about human intentions, and he argued that the council should prepare for the worst possible scenario. However, other delegates who had worked closely with humans insisted that this interpretation was inconsistent with everything they knew about human nature and behavior patterns. Engineer Bob Clark had spent years helping to rebuild war-torn worlds, and his dedication to healing, rather than destruction, had been typical of human approaches to galactic problems. Kate Russell had devoted her entire career to developing medical treatments that could save lives across multiple species, and her research had been freely shared with anyone who could benefit from it. The idea that humans like Bob and Kate were secretly preparing for conquest seemed absurd to anyone who had actually worked with them on humanitarian projects. Council's own member species were beginning to fracture under the strain of trying to maintain galactic civilization without human participation. Ancient rivalries that had been kept under control through human mediation were resurging as different species competed for influence and resources. The cooperative spirit that had characterized council operations for the past 20 years was being replaced by suspicion and territorial behavior economic systems that had been carefully balanced through human trade expertise were collapsing as species attempted to negotiate agreements without the neutral perspective that humans had provided. Several major trade partnerships had dissolved completely, and the resulting economic disruption was creating political instability across multiple star systems. The younger council members who had initially welcomed humanity's departure as an opportunity for other species to take greater responsibility were discovering that the challenges were far more complex than they had anticipated. Representative Kolmesh's own attempts to fill human roles had been unsuccessful, and his proposals were consistently rejected by other council members who did not trust his motives. Chairman Zextel found himself reviewing historical records from before humanity joined the council, and the comparison was deeply troubling. The galaxy had been far more violent and unstable during that earlier period, with frequent wars between species and economic systems that benefited only the most powerful civilizations. Humanity's contributions had created a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity that was now ending. Council chamber sessions had become exercises in frustration as delegates struggled to address problems that seemed to have no solutions without human expertise and perspective. Issues that would have been resolved quickly through human mediation were becoming permanent sources of conflict between species that could not find common ground. Dr. Lisa Parker's medical research had been scheduled to provide cures for several diseases that were affecting multiple species, but her work had been discontinued when humans withdrew from galactic affairs. Patients who had been participating in clinical trials were left without access to treatments that could have saved their lives. Captain Gary Bennett's transport vessels had been essential for moving emergency supplies to disaster areas and refugee populations, but his ships had been recalled to human space along with all other human assets. The Council's remaining transport capacity was insufficient to handle the current crisis, and civilian populations were suffering from shortages of food and medical supplies. Silence from human space remained as complete and mysterious as ever, despite the Council's increasingly desperate attempts to re-establish communication. Whatever humans were doing during their isolation, it clearly required total commitment of their resources and attention. The scale of their activities suggested preparation for something unprecedented. In galactic history, intelligence reports indicated that human space had become virtually unrecognizable, with new installations and facilities appearing on previously uninhabited worlds. The construction projects appeared to be nearing completion, but their purpose remained completely unknown to outside observers who could only guess at what humans were preparing to do. 3 years after humanity's departure from galactic affairs, the truth began to emerge through fragments of intercepted transmissions and deep space observations that revealed the scope of what humans had been preparing during their silence. The massive construction projects that had puzzled alien intelligence agencies were not weapons platforms or invasion fleets, as many had feared, but something far more profound and unexpected. Dr. Andy Martin's theoretical work on long-range navigation had become reality in ways that challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about space travel and exploration. The energy signatures that had been detected around human worlds were not military preparations, but the power systems for generation ships, designed to carry entire populations on journeys that would span centuries and cross distances that no galactic civilization had ever attempted. Engineer Susan Price's closed-loop life support systems had been scaled up to sustain millions of humans for indefinite periods without any external resources or support. The enormous vessels under construction were not warships, but mobile worlds capable of supporting complete human civilizations. During voyages to destinations beyond the galactic rim, where no alien species had ever ventured, the few non-human observers who had been permitted to remain in human space during the isolation period were finally allowed to share their testimony with the broader galactic community. Their reports painted a picture of humanity engaged in the most ambitious undertaking in the history of galactic civilization, as they prepared to abandon everything they had built in order to seek their destiny among the stars. Captain Gary Bennett was among the last human officers to maintain contact with alien representatives, and his final message to the Council explained humanity's decision in terms that were both simple and profound. Humans had chosen to leave the galaxy, not because of anger or disappointment with their alien neighbors, but because they had concluded that their destiny lay elsewhere. The message was broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously, so that every species in the galaxy would receive it at the same time. Captain Bennett's words were calm and measured, as he explained that humanity thanked the Council for 20 years of cooperation and shared progress, but had decided to seek new challenges beyond the borders of known space. Humanity's silence had not been anger or disappointment, but preparation for a journey from which they did not intend to return. The isolation had been necessary to prevent emotional attachments and end political complications from interfering with the massive undertaking that required total commitment from every human world and colony. The generation ships that had been under construction were nearly ready for their departure, and they represented the culmination of human engineering and scientific achievement. Each vessel was designed to carry complete ecosystems and cultural institutions that would preserve human civilization during the long journey to distant galaxies. In the weeks following Captain Bennett's message, human automated systems began sharing their complete databases with the species they were leaving behind. Decades of research and innovation that had been locked away during the isolation period were suddenly available to any alien scientist or engineer who wanted to study them. Dr. Lisa Parker's final medical research included cures for diseases that had been considered incurable by galactic medical science. Her work on cross-species treatments was freely shared, along with detailed instructions for implementing the procedures safely. The irony was profound, as humanity's greatest gift to galactic medicine came at the moment of their departure. Ambassador Kevin Harper's final diplomatic report contained detailed recommendations for maintaining the peace that humanity had helped establish during their 20 years of Council membership. His analysis of potential conflict zones included suggested solutions that other species could implement without human mediation. The report acknowledged that alien species would need to develop new approaches to diplomacy and conflict resolution. But Kevin expressed confidence that the lessons learned during years of cooperation with humans would provide a foundation for continued galactic stability. His recommendations were practical and detailed enough to serve as a guide for Council operations. In humanity's absence, economic analyst Maria Williams provided complete documentation of all trade agreements and financial systems that she had designed during her career. Her prosperity treaty was explained in sufficient detail that alien economists could maintain and adjust it as needed. The financial instruments that had stabilized interstellar commerce were accompanied by instructions for their ongoing management. The database also included Maria's analysis of potential economic challenges that the galaxy might face without human participation. Her recommendations for addressing these challenges were thorough and demonstrated her continued concern for galactic prosperity, even as humanity prepared to abandon it. Forever military strategist General Carl Peterson's final contribution was a comprehensive guide to conflict prevention and resolution that incorporated lessons learned from all his successful interventions. His unconventional diplomatic approaches were explained in detail, with examples of how they could be adapted for use by alien mediators. Guide included analysis of the 3 conflicts that had reignited during humanity's absence, along with suggested strategies for resolving them peacefully. General Peterson's recommendations showed his deep understanding of the cultural factors that drove different species toward violence and the methods that could redirect those impulses toward cooperation. Engineer Lucy Thompson shared the complete specifications for all infrastructure systems that she had designed, along with maintenance schedules and upgrade procedures that would allow alien engineers to continue using human technology effectively. Her designs had become the foundation for construction throughout Council space, and her final gift ensured that this foundation would remain stable. Dr. Helen Cruz provided all her research into quantum communications, including the theoretical breakthroughs that would have revolutionized galactic civilization if she had remained to complete the project. Her notes were detailed enough that alien scientists could continue the work, although it would likely take decades to achieve the same results without her direct guidance. The magnitude of humanity's final gift was staggering, as virtually every aspect of human knowledge and expertise was freely shared with the species they were leaving behind. The databases contained centuries of accumulated wisdom and innovation that had been developed through human participation in galactic civilization. Sherman Zexthal stood before the empty human section of the council chamber reading Dr. Lisa Parker's final medical research that contained treatments for diseases affecting his own species. The gesture was typical of everything humanity had contributed during their 20 years of membership, as they consistently offered their knowledge and expertise for the benefit of all galactic species. The council sessions that followed humanity's departure were unlike anything in the organization's history, as delegates struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they had witnessed. An entire species had chosen to walk away from everything they had built rather than fight for control or demand recognition for their contributions. The decision demonstrated a form of nobility that challenged every assumption about how intelligent species behaved when faced with difficult choices. Humans had trusted their legacy to the very aliens they were leaving behind, and had chosen departure over conquest when they could have easily dominated galactic civilization. To Force Council member Veltar of the Crystalline Collective spoke for many delegates when he observed that humanity's greatest gift was not their technology or their knowledge, but their example of how a species could choose its own destiny without destroying what others had built. The lesson was profound and would influence galactic civilization for generations to come. Representative Kolmish of the Epsilon Syndicate, who had often criticized human participation in council affairs, found himself defending humanity's reputation against species that accused them of abandonment. His transformation from critic to defender illustrated how even humanity's former opponents had gained respect for their final decision. The long-range sensors that monitored the edges of galactic space began detecting the departure of human generation ships over the following months. The vessels were enormous beyond anything previously imagined, and they carried populations that numbered in the millions. Each ship was a complete world unto itself, with ecosystems and institutions that could sustain human civilization indefinitely. Ships departed in waves over several months as humanity gradually emptied their worlds and colonies throughout council space. The process was orderly and methodical, with each group following carefully planned schedules that ensured no one was left behind. The empty worlds they left contained infrastructure and resources that other species could use, but the humans themselves were gone forever. Captain Gary Bennett, aboard the colonial transport New Horizons, transmitted the final human message as his ship crossed the galactic boundary. His words were brief and carried the weight of finality as he thanked the galaxy for 20 years of shared progress and wished the remaining species well in their future endeavors.